Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. This is the show where I look at every classic Doctor Who story, plus a bunch of big finish audio dramas. One episode a day, 7 days a week, and today, on the 21st of October 2019, I am starting a look at the Peter Davison era of Doctor Who, and the start of Season 19. Starting with Castrovalva, Part 1. Castrovalva Part 1 picks up, like all regeneration stories do, right where the previous story left off. And this time, with actually, weirdly enough, a recap for those coming in late of, basically to be like, hey, here's the new Doctor, here's what happened last time. The Doctor regenerated in the first time on television as originally broadcast, we've had a pre-credit sequence. There was a pre-credit sequence for the animation of the Power of the Daleks, and I believe actually for the animation of the Macroterror, though we covered the reconstruction because it hadn't been released yet. But this is the first story to actually have a real pre-credit sequence. I say that because it's, and you know what, it is one of those really solid, it's actually a solid move, showing that Tom Baker regenerates and we get Peter Davison. Now, that being said, there's quite a bit here with Castrovalva Part 1 that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of. This is the first episode with the new Doctor, and it really should be spent letting us get to know the new Doctor. And it really doesn't do that. It's one of those, the episode spends a lot of time with the companions and in the TARDIS, but the fifth Doctor himself, as played by Peter Davison, doesn't make perhaps the best impression that he could. I say this because he spends most of the episode not really forming himself as the Doctor. He is, the idea here is that he's going through this regeneration crisis, but that's quite weird, because this regeneration, if you look at it in context, wasn't that bad of a regeneration. Like, it wasn't worse than his previous regeneration. This is like 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. There wasn't that much trauma, like is kind of implied here. Really, it was just a pretty standard change due to fall damage, essentially. But I do like Peter Davison sort of cycling through the different regenerations, and one scene I really do like, it's an entirely silent scene scored with some really good music, is the Doctor picking out his costume, where he basically finds this cricketer's jacket and then this room in the TARDIS with a bunch of cricketer stuff, and he just makes an outfit out of that. It feels very resourceful, very Doctorish, even though, I'm gonna be honest, of all the classic series costumes, I think Peter Davison's is my least favorite, because it's just like, it's stuff that a cricketer would wear with a jacket over it. It's this very weird, and it's, honestly, the single color makes it kind of bland. Like, I know people really don't like Colin Baker's costume, but at least Colin Baker's costume, you won't forget it. The Fifth Doctor's costume is kind of forgettable. It doesn't really leave an impact. But, the actual scene of him picking it out is pretty good and pretty well done. A lot of the plot of this episode is also pretty light. It's essentially the Doctor, the Doctor wandering through the TARDIS while Adric kind of looks on, and then gets basically captured by the Master, and put into this contraption that looks very odd, shall we say? It's not a very... It looks very almost inappropriate for Doctor Who, just a little bit, and yeah, but Adric is there to basically to bounce dialogue off of and then get captured by the Master, while Tegan and Nyssa in the TARDIS basically try and find, you know, it's one of those really, really weird sort of introductions where, like, a lot of this episode takes place in the TARDIS, and it's like the TARDIS is put in flight, the Doctor really doesn't know where he's going, and the big cliffhanger moment is the TARDIS is crashing towards Event 1, which is basically the first event in the universe, and in doing so, it's sort of a... I guess the idea is that the universe itself is being created by this, and with the universe being created, there is kind of there's kind of this idea of a there's this idea that the story is just sort of there to be built up around them going to this universe. It's very interesting. It's a very, very interesting. There's some interesting concepts here about, the TARDIS flying and sort of the idea of each member of the team, because the Doctor is basically searching for this zero room so he can basically find a way to be basically to recuperate, and he basically makes this idea of the Nyssa, Tegan, and Adric being companions as like an actual crew, which I think is an interesting aspect and one that could easily be played up upon. But other than that, there isn't too much to this episode. That's one of the big problems. So overall, I'm going to give Castrovalva Part 1 a 6 out of 10. All right. It's the 22nd of October 2019. I just finished watching Part 2 of Castrovalva, where we actually get to the planet of Castrovalva. So, Part 2 of Castrovalva is one of those stories where you have where you have the where you have sort of this premise, right? And the premise is that is basically that the Doctor needs to go to Castrovalva. Basically, I think with the idea being that, with a lot of the idea being that, as it has zero room properties. We don't actually get to Castrovalva as a setting until halfway through Part 2. which is just, it doesn't quite work. Like, I do quite like some stuff in this episode. I do. I don't want to give the impression that this is like, oh, this is a terrible episode, one of the worst things I've ever seen. No, it's overall pretty harmless as an episode. But it does deal with some issues that there are some issues that I have with it. Mainly that as an episode, it spends far too much time in the TARDIS, and this is the episode where really the Fifth Doctor is in it the least. Like, he's in it less than part one, it feels like. And it's one of those things where, it's one of those things where you really have you have a story all about basically the idea is that the plot is basically trying to save the Doctor, which could be interesting, but I don't think that the it's that it's one of those things where you have the story being built up around the setting of Castrovalva, but the Doctor doesn't feel like he's actually in a lot of danger, because again, the regeneration wasn't that bad. It's one of those things where you have where you have a where you have you have just it's not it's the sort of the threat doesn't really equal sort of what the story builds up. They are it's one of those stories where there just isn't enough of the Doctor here. That's one of the biggest problems. Sure, the Doctor's a character, and yeah, he there's one moment where he kind of feels like the Doctor, but most of it, he's stuck inside the Zero Room, or stuck inside the Zero cabinet built up for basically for basically being a story that like you get a that you get going on. This is also a very interesting an interesting story for an episode for Tegan and Nyssa, as they spend a lot of it just walking through a forest in the latter half. But in the first half, they actually have to try to find a conclusion. Now, this is the story where they jettison 25% of the TARDIS, which is built up as a it's built up as a story about where it built up this story where the danger is they're heading towards event 1, so it's like, all right, the thrust we might need would be just basically exploding 25% of the TARDIS and getting out. Now, what it does is it does this big point, which almost feels like it's supposed to be a cliffhanger moment, where where basically the entire the entire story is kind of, you know, kind, this kind of idea, uh, you know, kind of being, this story uh, where there is, uh, where it's like, this is the cliffhanger moment. No, it keeps going on, because then they build, and the scene doesn't really work. They build a zero room out of like the missing pieces using the sonic screwdriver, which is just plain. That's just plain weird. It's a weird part of the episode and it doesn't make any sense. You know, it's just sort of a here's this kind of a potentially interesting idea, but you know, it's not actually. We're not actually doing a full story here, or even that good of a story. You know, it's just sort of this idea that's there. Like, and then Adric spends most of it with the Master in his sort of. I think it's supposed to be his TARDIS, but it looks like a sex dungeon. That's kind of the fandom joke, and is very much. You know, there's very much a, you know, a new sort of story, that kind of continues on. Overall, as a story, this episode is just kind of average. It's not great. Like, there's a lot of just walking through the woods, which are kind of these nice parts, and then the big cliffhanger moment is really underwhelming, especially because you have that zero cabinet's gone. The Doctor may not be able to fix his regeneration. That was you know, that was really there. It's really just a, you know, it's just a sort of, you know, it's just sort of a story that kind of just sort of moves halfway through to something kind of bleh. So I'm going to give Castrovalva Part 2 a 5 out of 10. Happy Mole Day, everyone. Yes, it's the 23rd of October, 2019, and I just finished watching Part 3 of Castrovalva, which spends most of its time in the city, but I still have some issues with it. Now, the plot itself does kind of move along a little more than it did previously, which I will commend it for that. It does take the time to actually, you know, make sure we realize that the plot of the story is moving. It's just not moving as quick as it perhaps could move. But this is a story. This is the episode where we actually get introduced to a lot of the, for lack of a better term, supporting characters of the story. Over halfway through, other than, like, outside of that bit part of, like, those guards in Part 1, it's just been the four main cast and Anthony Ainley as the Master in this story. So what Christopher H. Bidmead kind of here has to do is kind of set up this entire society of Castrovalva. The idea being that it's this castle on a hill, and it's sort of a utopia being overseen by the Portreeve, who is this, you know, this old man in white, you know, who's just sort of jolly and has some really good chemistry with Peter Davison. While you have Shardavan, who is this librarian. You know, you see, at the end of Part 2, you sort of saw some warriors who the implications that they stole the Doctor from the Zero Cabinet. Turns out they don't actually have a warrior society. Like, this society is, I guess, based off of intellect, intellectualism, and the like, and it's basically a utopia based off of that. The hunting is just sort of a revival of exercise. They don't actually hunt. They don't. It's not like, oh, we are actually hunters who do hunting things. It's a very weird story in that respect. That it's like that it builds up this story based around these types of characters, which I just think, I think it is kind of fascinating the way that the story builds and becomes tries to tell itself, but overall it's not that great of an episode, mainly because Peter Davison as the Doctor almost walks around forgetting who Adric is, and then he tries to have this angry, powerful scene against Tegan and Nyssa, for like, where is Adric? Why are you hiding Adric? It's not very good. They then try to escape Castrovalva in what's perhaps the most iconic cliffhanger that shows like the entire city is built on recursion, so like they keep getting back in the same place and twisting. And if I'm gonna be honest, the segments in Castrovalva, like in Castrovalva itself, the city, feel kind of like we're rushing through a full story. Just this opening doesn't feel like you're definitely doing a real bit of you're really showing what Castrovalva is, what it means to be, and really where it is. Adric and the Master are both off screen for most of this. There's one scene where Adric creates a perfect duplicate of himself to talk to Nyssa, which is, it's an interesting scene. It's the idea that Adric's still there, being a trick. But again, outside of that, there's absolutely nothing with his character done in this episode. He's literally just off screen for most of it, still hooked up to the Master's machine. There's also something just about the writing of this story from Christopher H. Bidmead that feels almost like it was written at the last minute. Now, I know that production-wise for season 19, this was the 4th story to go into production. And the first, obviously the first one aired because it picks up, it's obviously the follow-up to the regeneration and that whole story. But I wonder if, and there were stories of potential stories that were supposed to be the Fifth Doctor's first story, and I can't help but wonder if, in writing for this story, Christopher H. Bidmead kind of, I guess, failed. Doing it very much last minute and kind of just being like, all right, this kind of works. We'll put this here. Keep things going. Come on, try not to make things, try to make things make sense, but we don't have to worry too terribly much about it. It's a very, as a story, it's very odd that it's just like, hey, here's this kind of plot, and no real, and it's like, here's a bunch of ideas kind of thrown together last minute, but not really a full and sort of complete story being told here. It's just kind of it's just one of those it's just one of those stories where you get kind of a sense that that things are this is just sort of a complete sort of like, it's not really the most complete of stories, but it's one where it's like, right, we're trying to get things pulled together, and it's not entirely working nearly as well as we'd like. It's just sort of it's just kind of um, a a sort of um, it's just sort of a story where uh, where you really you really kind of you kind of try to get the story, but overall it's just pretty okay. You think things would pick up a little now that we're in Castrovalva, but they don't. So overall, I'm going to give Castrovalva uh, part um, part 3 a 4 out of 10. Alright, it's the 24th of October 2019, and I just finished watching part 4 of Castrovalva, the final episode of the story, and an episode that I'm not sure how much I want to actually discuss, because as a story, if I'm being genuinely honest, this is one that doesn't end very well. It's the episode, the episode is notable for a couple of really decent things. The twist that the Portreeve is the master near the end, which is great. Anthony Ainley in this story really shows how much of a versatile actor that he can be, as his disguise as the Portreeve is pretty good. He's putting on a voice. There's some moments where where he does do a little bit of slipping, and he does kind of slip back into the master, but he does give a good performance here. He is the best, and I will say, the music and the direction of this story have both been stellar. Paddy Kingsland is I believe it's Paddy Kingsland responsible for the music. There's a lot of sort of it feels very pastoral. It's not a pastoral yet 1980s. It's this very interesting way of it's a very interesting sort of way of doing the music, but that is really really nice. And I will say, and the direction here is by a completely, for the entire story, it's been done by Fiona Cumming, who this is her first story as director. She's worked as a production assistant for a long while, actually. But I believe she started as assistant floor manager and a production assistant. I know she worked on The Highlanders. There's a famous little clip of film that actually has a little bit of it basically has the TARDIS. It's a little accident clip of film that happens to exist that starts with her doing the clapperboard. It's interesting, and so this, and she'll go on to direct a couple more stories as the series goes on. And it's actually really really nice dynamic direction. Fiona Cumming was a solid director, and was very much an advocate for the program, and did a lot of good work here. Sadly, Christopher H. Bidmead's script is, I'm going to be honest, this is probably the weakest script Bidmead ever gave to the program. It feels rushed, and it feels like it has some good ideas. It has some ideas, but it doesn't quite know how it wants to work them out. And it doesn't know how it wants to work them out, and how it doesn't necessarily know how it wants to conclude everything. Like, a lot of this is like the part 3 cliffhanger was recursion. The idea of that the entire Castrovalva was recursion. this entire episode is basically, the first half is basically trying to get some people from Castrovalva on its side, go to the Portreeve, reveal the Portreeve as the master, reveal that Adric has been the one who's basically been in, holding Castrovalva together and being, and being there. But it's one of those things where you just sort of have this story, rushing almost to a conclusion, and it doesn't necessarily work. I will say, Michael Sheard appears in this episode. He was in Pyramids of Mars in a great part. He was in The Ark. He was in The Mind of Evil. He was in The Invisible Enemy. This is his penultimate Doctor Television appearance. He does get to be in one audio drama much later down the line, and has done a lot of stuff in just for Doctor Who. And he is great as in the role and as a character. That he does do an excellent job he does an excellent job in this tiny role. The guy playing Shardavan also does a really good job. He really does have a good sense of he does a really good job in the role and plays the role really well. But overall, this episode, it's not great. It doesn't leave the story with a good solid ending, so it gets close to being at least okay, but it never quite reaches it. So overall, I'm going to give Castrovalva Part 4 a 4 out of 10. That being said, we do add up and average the scores to give Castrovalva a final score of 4.75 out of 10. Thank you everybody for watching this installment of the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. That is one Peter Davison down, many more to go. As always, please leave a like, comment. I like to get a conversation going down in the comments, and subscribe if you haven't already, and click the bell so you receive notifications. And join me next time when we actually start taking a look at Peter Davison's audio run as the Doctor in the earliest Doctor Who audio chronologically, and one of Big Finish's more famous special releases with Jonathan Morris's Psychodrome.